With the debt deal that was reached this summer, are we any closer to having some sensible deficit reduction that you've been talking about ever since you came to Congress?
Well, I think we're closer in regards to people recognizing we have to do something. I don't think we're any closer in terms of doing anything. I think what happened is we kicked the can down the road, and I think by November or December, I don't think anything significant is going to happen. I think 60 votes will change the requirements of what happened in the Senate, and we just won't do it. I mean, that's a skeptical opinion. I think what's going to happen, has to happen, is the American people are going to have to demand certain fundamental changes, like a constitutional amendment to balance the budget, actually making the hard cuts in areas where people routinely don't want us to make hard cuts, and people being willing to lose their position as an elected representative to either Congress or the Senate, House or the Senate, to actually fix what's wrong with our country.
Now, let me ask you about that balanced budget amendment. Could we have fought World War II with a balanced budget?
Sure, because it has
so?
an exception that you can borrow money for a national emergency in terms of time of war.
Now, in July, you presented your Back in Black program, and you really saved no sacred cows. Entitlements, defense, agricultural subsidies, they were all in there. Can such a proposal make it through the buzzsaw of special interest that Washington, D.C. is?
Probably not, but you know, I didn't put it out there so that it would get voted on. They weren't going to vote on it anyway. I put it out there because nobody has ever put forward specific spending reductions in detail, backed up by research that says you should do these things. So there's $8 trillion, $7 trillion in actual spending cuts, $1 trillion in tax giveaways that are reduced, and $1 trillion in savings on interest if you were to do those things.
Now, I found it a little bit ironic that you were criticized by the no tax pledge crowd for trying to close some loopholes, to corporate loopholes and things to the wealthy. What's your reaction to that?
I think they're misguided. I think Americans ought to be very careful about anything they hear from Washington, whether it's inside the Senate or interest groups outside trying to influence it, because most of the time there's agenda behind it. And the agenda is not necessarily what is presented when you hear from those organizations.
Can we ever get the heavy lifting of reducing the deficit? Can we get it done as long as we have two sides, whether it be left or right, that has very hard ideologic rigidness?
Sure, it's going to happen.
How?
But nobody's going to loan us the money. It's going to happen. You know, Ben Bernanke said that 2.5 years ago. It's not that these things aren't going to happen. It's how painful are they going to be when they happen, and are they going to be done under our control? So I will tell you, within 2 or 3 years, we're going to make all these hard decisions. The question is will we do it because we no longer can borrow money and we're like Greece and have to? In other words, as a condition of getting the next dose of morphine, money, will you do these things, or will we do it in a way that protects the underlying social safety net better and in a way that preserves the future for our kids better? And so we're going to do it. You know, it's like saying, you know, Medicare is going to change whether people on Medicare want it to change or not. And that is because there's no way we can borrow the money to fund it unless we change it.
Okay, so does this all go back to maybe the same debate we were having 2 years ago about health care?
Well, a lot of it's health care. A lot of our problems are health care. You know, we're going to spend about $800 billion of the federal government, of your money, actually borrowed money, on health care. And how we do it is very inefficient. $1 and $3 gets wasted. We need to fix health care. And the plans that have been passed in the last year aren't going to fix it in a way that is sustainable without rationing care and markedly decreasing the quality of care.
I want to ask you about something that I've heard you say in talking about family responsibility to the elderly and the frail. I have family that are, as they reach those final years of their life, I know that I was very thankful for some of the government programs in place. It made everyone's life easier. I would have hated to had private insurance going through and doing all the things I have to do with private insurance when my mother was in a medical facility. Reaction to that?
Well, it's great that the government thought it could afford to do that for you, but in fact it was borrowing money and borrowing the future potential of your kids to be able to do that. So it's a trade-off. We can cut our kids' legs off and say, you don't get the economic opportunity. You're going to have a tax rate that's twice what ours was, because quite frankly, we've benefited over the last 30 years off your next 30 years of prosperity, potential prosperity. So, you know, it's a trade-off. And, you know, the Americans are going to make that decision outside of once we get past the big hiccup that we have in terms of our debt. But until then, international financiers are going to tell you whether or not we're going to be able to do that for your mother.
And Dr. Coburn, you know you're kind of prescribing a very bitter pill.
Well, you know, it's easy to spend money that's not yours, but when the bill comes due, you still have to pay the bill. And what many young people and middle-aged people in this country want to deny that there's a bill coming due. And the fact is that there it is. And so you can, it doesn't have to be all that bitter. What it is it's a rejection of our heritage. Our heritage, the thing that made our country great was sacrifice. And now we have people saying, no, I don't want to sacrifice. I don't have to give up anything to get our country right again. We're going to have to give up a lot. And everybody's going to have to. And if we don't, then you know what? We're going to have a markedly lowered standard of living. We're not going to have the things that you thought were great for your mother. They're not going to be there. No matter who's paying for them, they're not going to be there. So it's a matter of really stark choices, because we've had a career politicians that have refused to make choices and refused to be honest with the American people about the situation that our country's really in. You know, I found it really interesting that there was an article by 3 members of the super committee, the new super committee, yesterday in the Wall Street Journal about how we had to get together and do this, and those are the same people that have hardly ever voted for any amendments I've ever offered on the Senate floor. So, you know, the irony of the career politician is actually sickening to me, that they'll play the games. Here I am here, but when you really get a chance to do something, you don't do it, and now I'm proposing that we do something. I think that is our biggest sickness.
Now, as a member of the Gang of Six, and as I understand some of those proposals, it was kicking the hardest part down the road just a little bit.
Well, it didn't address enough of the entitlements. That was my big problem with it.
The reason why you pulled out for a while?
Yeah, is only $600 billion, and we need a couple of trillion in entitlement changes.
Can our economy withstand the drastic things that some people are proposing?
Like what?
If we have all of these reductions right now, if we start immediately on trying to reduce the deficit, can our livelihoods, can they withstand it?
No, you're going to have, first of all, you wouldn't do it all at once, because the negative economic impact would be too great. But that's a totally different scenario than saying you're cutting spending when in fact you're increasing spending $830 billion. I mean, those are two different things.
And essentially just slowing spending is what's going on.
Well, they're not even slowing spending. They're slowing spending over what they were wanting to spend. You know, it's kind of like your son saying, I want my first car to be a Corvette, and you say, no, you're going to have a Chevrolet Nova. You know, he's saying, well, I didn't get my Corvette. The fact is he was never going to get the Corvette, and we were never going to spend that money. So the claims out of Washington of cutting spending are absolutely farcical. And that's our problem. The lack of clear and effective, straightforward talk to the American people so they can understand what the real problem is and what the real solutions are. And so can we fix our problems? Yes. Can we fix our problem with the leadership that we have today, both Republican and Democrat? I don't think so.
So short of throwing everyone out, which we typically don't do, we keep our favorite people, our local guys in, and everyone does that in every district around the nation. How does it work?
Well, I don't know. You had an 85 position swing in the U.S. House in 2010. I suspect you'll have a big swing in the Senate in 2012. I suspect you'll have even a bigger swing in the House, or more towards that. The American people are getting informed, and what they're finally finding out is the truth about what Congress has been dishonest with them about. You know, and so the hard decisions are coming. we can make it to where we protect those who are most dependent on us. We can make it to where it doesn't hurt as bad. But for me and you, healthy Americans that have a future in front of us, we're going to have to work hard. We're going to have to contribute more. We're going to have to do more, and we're going to have to take less. And that's the answer. And anybody that tells you something other than that either is drinking something funny or isn't looking at the real numbers.
We've been talking quite a bit about cutting. I want to talk to you about revenues. Recent op-ed by Warren Buffett, the sage of Omaha, everyone typically respects what he has to say, says the wealthy are not taxed enough. Would you agree with that?
I disagree.
Why so?
The top 20% in this country pay 84% of the taxes. The top 20% pay 84% of the taxes. 51% of the people in this country pay zero taxes, including Medicare and Social Security. So you have over half the country benefiting, paying nothing, and you have 1/5 of the population paying 84% of the rest of the tax bill. If Warren Buffett wants to pay more taxes, he's welcome to do it. There's a little check mark that he can pay on there, and he can pay as many billions as he wants. The fact is what happened, the problem is not tax revenue. And I've voted to change tax revenue. The problem is we have a government that's entirely too big, that's outside the bounds of the enumerated powers of the Constitution, that spends money that we don't have on things that we don't need. And Warren, it's easy. Once you've got your money paid, that's fine. Warren makes all his money on capital gains and dividends. His tax rate's 15%.
Which is very, very low.
Yeah. Whereas yours is 23, 24%. Absolutely. So if he doesn't like it, all he has to do is contribute. But the fact is he's creating jobs by having that capital reinvested. Instead of paying 24% or 26%, and he's paying 15%, that 10 or 11% goes back in as capital formation that actually creates jobs. So do you think the government actually creates jobs with increased revenue? The last stimulus that we had actually had a negative economic multiplier. It was less than 1.0, which means for every dollar we spent, we got less than $1 in economic activity.
But there are a lot of jobs here, I know of even in the state, that probably people would be unemployed if it wasn't for that stimulus. And they were typically state government jobs.
Well, but tell me what of value in terms of economic growth, what increased economic wealth is created by a federal government or a state government job?
Well, I would argue
there's no economic multiplier to that.
But do they not pay taxes just like
Sure,
everyone else?
but the point is that's not the question. The question is, could you have taken the same money and created a value that would have enhanced economic growth far greater? The cost per job of the stimulus was $280,000. Now, we didn't pay Oklahomans that continued to keep their job $280,000, but that's what the cost was to keep an Oklahoman who worked for the government in their job. You tell me that's efficient economics. It's not.
So would we have been wiser to have kept the money in federal coffers, or would we have been wiser to invest it differently?
Well, the point is we borrowed all the money, so there wasn't any money in federal coffers. We went to the Chinese and said, "Would you loan us some money?" So first of all, we borrowed it. So there's an interest cost, a carrying cost that's associated with it. That's number one. Number two, we would have been better off just giving it to the American people and say, you go decide. Because had we taken the same amount of money, divided it across the population, said you go spend it, the economic multiplier would have been about 1.5. In other words, we would have created at least $500 billion worth of economic activity, more than what was created. And that's just by taking money and giving it to the American people. However, the problem is the federal government doesn't create jobs. It inhibits job creation through its regulations, through its codes, through everything that it does, through the paperwork trail that you have to accomplish. What we need to do is have less federal government and more private sector, and that's how you're going to create jobs. All you have to do is look at the increase and of the change in the slopes of employment of the last 4 recessions, including this one. And there's a big factor there, and the big factor there is government regulation and the cost of government as a percentage of our cost of GDP in our economy. And as it has grown, recoveries have slowed because people don't want to put the capital back to work, because the return on the capital, because of the government, is so far less.
Does that include defense and
Sure.
all the contractors here in Oklahoma that support
Sure.
defense?
The point is had I done a economic stimulus plan. We had $880 billion. $29 billion went for infrastructure. That's all. Of that $29 billion, you got a 1.7 multiplier. In other words, for that $29 billion, you got 70% of that back in additional economic growth. The rest of it you didn't. So we're going to have to reset the military coming home from Afghanistan and Iraq. We're going to buy equipment. We should have bought it. We could have bought it at a lower price. You would have had an economic multiplier far greater than minus, less than 1. You would have had one of 1.7, 1.8. We're going to buy it anyway. Why wouldn't we do it on one that actually creates real jobs, real wealth, and actually grows the economy? What we did with the stimulus plan was transfer the worst habit of Washington to the states. And the worst habit of Washington is it doesn't matter, you don't have to live within your means. So what happened in Oklahoma this year? Last year we had stimulus money. This year we didn't, right? Correct. So we made the tough choices this year. We just delayed by a year making the tough choices.
And thankfully, the price of oil and gas was up, and so.
Well, but the point is we still delayed by a year, making the tough choices, which means, had we made those tough choices earlier, we would have been in better shape than we were. And don't take Oklahoma; take every other state because they all got the ARRA funds. The fact is we delayed the onset of the time at which they had to make the decisions they should have made a year ago. And said, don't worry, we'll bail you out. And the next time something like this happens, they're going to be looking to Washington. And we don't have any money. We're at $14.8 trillion. In 2 weeks, we've gone up $450 billion in debt. And just in 2 weeks, we're at $14.8 trillion now, rising, and we don't have any way of getting out of that. So the question is will we make the hard choices together, both ends of the political spectrum, to do what is necessary to secure the future of our country? And that's the question that still hadn't been answered.
I'll leave you with this one last question. I've followed your career since you first went into Congress, since you went in the House of Representatives. And in that time, you have pretty much been singing from the same songbook about wasteful spending and deficit reduction. What makes this time different?
Well, I think it's pretty obvious is we're about to crash. I mean, look at what's happening in the stock market today. It's down 480 points. Why? Because there's worry about the ability of the European banks. The fact is we're leveraged more than we can afford to pay the interest. We're like the individual who has 4 credit cards and you're trying to open the 5th credit card to pay the minimum balance on the interest on the other 4 and you can't get it. Well, that's where we are. You cannot borrow your way to prosperity, and you can't spend your way out of debt. And so what we have to do is we have to start retracting, and we can do that in an orderly way that protects those that are most dependent on us, and we can start living within our means. And the point is, I used to worry about my kids. I don't worry about my kids anymore. I'm worried about us. I used to think this was 5 or 10 years off. It's not. It's next year or the year after. It's coming. And if you can't see it, then you're not paying attention to the news.
Thank you, Dr. Coburn.
You're welcome. Good to talk to you.